I've carried letters across Montana for 40 years. Some brought joy, wedding invitations, birth announcements, news of inheritances from relatives back east who finally remembered the family they'd left behind. Some brought heartbreak, black-bordered death notices, foreclosure papers, letters that started with, "I'm sorry," and ended with goodbye. But the strangest delivery I ever made wasn't a letter at all. It was watching a woman burn 3 months of lies in a cabin stove while the man who saved her life stood silent in the doorway, his face carrying the kind of hurt that has no words attached to it. My name is Wilbur Crane. I'm 70 years old now, and this is my last ride. Tomorrow, I hand over my mail satchel to young Tommy Preston, who doesn't know yet that carrying letters means carrying other people's lives. He'll learn. The territory teaches everyone eventually. But today, riding through this valley one final time, I can't stop thinking about them. Silas McCrae and Faith Garrett. Folks still ask me about them. They want to know if the stories are true. If she really walked 40 miles on a promise that didn't exist. If the whole town really turned against her. If love can bloom from that kind of ruin. I tell them this. I was there. I carried the letters. I watched it unfold. And I'm here to tell you that truth is stranger and harder than any legend you've heard whispered in saloons or stitched into quilts by women with too much time and too little to talk about. It started the way most Montana stories do, with weather mean enough to kill a man and a choice that would change everything. The day was September 16th, 1879. I remember because I just delivered the mail to Willow Creek and was heading back toward the valley when the sky opened up like someone had torn it in half. Rain came down so hard it looked like the clouds were emptying themselves of every drop they'd ever held. I made it to the way station at Miller's Creek just in time. Silas McCrae wasn't so lucky. He was 3 miles from home when it hit. I know because I found the spot later, saw where his horse had struggled through the mud, the hoof prints deep and desperate. Silas rode with his hat pulled low, barely able to see his horse's ears through the sheets of water coming down like judgment. He was used to storms. Montana doesn't coddle anyone. He was used to loneliness too. But he'd never seen anything like the shape he spotted on the roadside that day. A small figure huddled in the mud. A woman, soaked through, barely sitting upright, more like she'd collapsed and was held up only by the fact that she hadn't quite decided to lie down and die yet. Silas pulled the reins and slowed his horse. The closer he got, the more the sight tightened something in his chest. Something he'd thought had gone numb years ago when his brother Robert sold half their father's land and disappeared with the money. Something he'd buried the winter he nearly starved, burning furniture to stay warm in a cabin that felt bigger and emptier with every stick of kindling he fed to the stove. Her dress clung to her thin frame like it was painted on. Mud coated the hem so thick it looked like she'd waded through a river. Her shoes had worn through at the bottom, the leather split open to show pale skin underneath. Feet that had walked too far too long on roads that didn't care whether she made it or not. She held a small valise in both hands, gripped it like it was the last thing she owned in the world, which, as it turned out, it was. She looked up at him. Her brown eyes were red around the edges, not from crying, from days without tears left to give, the kind of empty that comes when you've already wrung yourself dry and there's nothing left but the exhausted shell of who you used to be. Silas didn't speak right away. He wasn't much for talking in general. Living alone for 5 years does that to a man. Words start to feel unnecessary, extravagant even. But something about her silence demanded his. "Where are you headed?" he asked. His voice came out rough from disuse, like a door that hadn't been opened in months. It startled him a little, hearing it out loud. He'd spoken to exactly 3 people in the last 2 weeks. Pete Tucker at the saloon, the shopkeeper when buying flour, and his horse when it stepped in a gopher hole. The woman stared at him through the pounding rain. Water ran down her face in rivers. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, she said it. I don't know any more. 3 words. They hit Silas harder than the storm. Behind them, the town of Willow Creek was 5 miles of mud and misery. His cabin was only 1 mile away. He looked toward the road, then back at her shaking form. She was trembling so hard he could see it even through the rain. Something old and half-buried stirred in him. Something he'd tried to forget existed after Robert left. After the creditors came looking for money Silas didn't have, after he'd learned that trusting anyone, even family, especially family, was a fool's game. But here she was, and here he was, and the rain wasn't stopping. He reached down his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, studied his face like she was trying to decide if this was another trap, another lie, another promise that would break the moment she believed in it. Then she took it. Her fingers were ice cold. They trembled in his grip. Silas pulled her up onto his horse. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel every rib through the wet fabric of her dress as she settled in front of him, leaning back against his chest because she didn't have the strength to sit upright on her own. They rode through the storm toward his cabin, the weight of her shivering body pressed against him. Neither of them spoke. They say kindness shows up when we need it most. Sometimes it comes wearing a muddy hat, riding a tired horse, offered by a man who doesn't speak much but means every word he does say. Sometimes it comes from a stranger who has his own reasons for understanding what it means to be left with nothing. I wasn't there for that part. I was holed up at Miller's Creek, drinking bad coffee and waiting for the rain to stop. But I heard about it later. Silas told me some of it. Faith told me the rest. And what they didn't say, I filled in from knowing them both, knowing their silences as well as their words. Inside the cabin, the place smelled of wood smoke and neglect. Dishes sat in the basin with old beans dried on the edges, hard as stones. Dust lined the window so thick it looked like frost from the inside. The floor hadn't been swept in weeks, maybe months. Silas had been living alone so long he hardly noticed the mess anymore. A man can get used to anything if he's left with it long enough. He knelt by the stove and fed it kindling until the fire caught. Behind him, the woman stood dripping onto his floor. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself. That valise was still clutched against her ribs like a shield. Like if she let go of it, she'd disappear entirely. Silas grabbed a wool blanket from the chest by his bed. He held it out without looking at her face. Couldn't quite bring himself to meet her eyes yet. Didn't know what he'd see there. Gratitude, suspicion, despair. Wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Get warm," he said. She took it. Her cold fingers brushed his for just a second. The touch sent something through him he hadn't felt in years. Not desire exactly, more like recognition. Like his body remembered what it was to be near another human being and was shocked to discover the memory still existed. He poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it near the fire. She wrapped both hands around it. He saw how badly they trembled. She hadn't eaten right in days. Anyone could see that. Her wrists were thin as branches. Her cheekbones stood out sharp beneath skin that looked stretched too tight. Silas sat across from her on the floor. Steam rose from her dress as it dried. The smell of wet wool filled the room, mixed with a faint trace of lavender that must have clung to her clothes from another life. A life before this, before walking 40 miles on broken shoes, before rain and mud and strangers. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm hammered the roof. She finally spoke. "Ohio," she whispered. Her voice was soft but steady, like she'd told this story before, maybe to herself, walking those 40 miles, practicing the words until they didn't hurt quite so much to say out loud. "My folks died when I was 17. Scarlet fever took them the same week." Silas nodded. He didn't speak. He knew loss too, knew what it was to bury people and keep walking because there wasn't any other choice. His own parents had died when he was 14, his mother first, then his father 3 months later, like he'd just been waiting for permission to follow her. "I worked in a sewing factory," she said. 12 hours a day. Then I saw the advertisement. Her hands tightened around the cup. A Montana rancher seeking a wife, hard-working and sincere. She said the words like she was reading them from memory, like they were carved into her mind the way names get carved into gravestones, permanent, inescapable. We wrote letters for 3 months. Her voice stayed low, steady, like she was telling someone else's story, not her own. Like if she kept enough distance from it, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much. He said he'd meet me at the Willow Creek Depot, said he'd be wearing a blue kerchief so I'd know him. She swallowed hard. I sold everything for a train ticket. There was no going back. Let me tell you about those letters. I carried 7 of them myself, from Cincinnati to Willow Creek, addressed to James Hollister at the General Mercantile. I remember because the handwriting was so careful. The kind of careful that comes from someone who doesn't write often, but wants every word to look right, to matter. I'd see James pick them up. He'd smile, tip his hat, make some joke about how the mail was his favorite part of the week. I thought he was a man in love. Thought I was watching something good unfold, something rare in a territory where loneliness killed more men than weather or gunfights ever did. I didn't know he was a man collecting trophies. I didn't know there were 11 other women whose letters I'd carried over the years, all addressed to different names, different towns, different men who never existed, all part of the same scheme. I didn't know I was the one putting those lies in their hands. That's something I'll carry to my grave. Back in the cabin, Faith kept talking. 2 days at the depot, she said, sleeping on a bench, waiting. Her fingers moved to the clasp of the valise. She opened it slow, like she was opening a coffin. Inside was a stack of letters tied with kitchen string. The paper was soft from rain. The ink had smudged in places, turning words into watercolor ghosts of what they used to say. His name was James Hollister, she said. He said he had a ranch. Silas froze. James Hollister ran the mercantile in town. He had a wife, Sarah, a quiet woman who never quite smiled with her eyes. 2 children, both under 10. A white picket fence that he painted every spring, and he'd never owned a ranch in his life. The man barely left town except to visit suppliers in Helena twice a year. Faith watched Silas closely. You know him? It wasn't a question. Silas nodded once. His jaw was tight. He's got a family. The fire crackled between them. Rain hammered the roof like fists demanding entry. Faith didn't break. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood slow and deliberate and walked to the stove. She untied the kitchen string. 1 letter at a time, she fed them into the flames. The ink curled. The paper blackened. 3 months of lies burned away in seconds. Silas watched from his place on the floor. He saw the way her shoulders stayed straight, the way her hands didn't shake, even though the rest of her was trembling, the way she never looked away from the fire, like she was making sure every last word turned to ash before she'd let herself believe they were really gone. When the last piece of paper caught fire, she spoke. I walked 40 miles, she said. 1 woman gave me bread. That was all. She closed the stove door, turned to face him. You can stay, Silas said. The words came out before he'd decided to say them, before he'd thought them through, before he could stop himself and remember all the reasons why letting anyone close was a mistake he'd already made once and paid for dearly, as long as you need. She didn't answer right away, just stood there looking at him with those red-rimmed eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little, looking at him like she was trying to decide if this was real, if he was real, if anything could be real after walking 40 miles on a lie. Then she nodded, once, so small he almost missed it. Faith slept through most of the next day. Silas checked on her twice. She lay curled beneath the wool blanket, breathing deep and even. Her body was paying the debt of 40 miles through country that didn't care whether she lived or died, through rain and mud and roads that went nowhere unless you were lucky enough to find someone waiting at the end. He stood in the doorway and watched her sleep, tried to remember the last time another person had been in this cabin. His brother, probably. 5 years ago now, the night before Robert left. They'd fought about the land. Robert wanted to sell to the railroad company. Said they could both walk away rich, start over somewhere else, somewhere easier. Silas had refused. Not because he loved the land, though he did in a way that had nothing to do with sense or profit, but because his father had made him promise right before he died. Made him swear on his mother's grave that he'd never let the land go to someone who didn't love it the way they had. Robert had called him a fool, left in the middle of the night with half the deed and all the money from selling it. Silas had spent the next 3 winters working himself half to death just to pay off the debts Robert left behind. Creditors who didn't care that he'd been betrayed, who just wanted their money and didn't much mind if collecting it meant taking the roof from over a 19-year-old kid's head. He'd survived, barely, and he'd learned his lesson. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But looking at Faith now, sleeping in his cabin with her dress still damp and her shoes drying by the fire, he felt something shift. Something that scared him more than the winter ever had. When she finally came out the next morning, Silas woke to a smell he hadn't known in years. Cornbread. He sat up, disoriented. For a moment he thought he was 14 again, back before his mother died. Back when the cabin was full of life and warmth and the smell of food that someone made because they cared whether you ate or not. Then he remembered. Faith stood at the stove with her hair pinned up tight. She wore an old apron she must have found in the chest, his mother's apron, though he hadn't seen it in over a decade. The table was clean, the basin was empty, the dishes were stacked neatly by the window. His cabin didn't look like his cabin anymore. "I don't take charity," she said without turning around. Her voice was firm, matter-of-fact. The voice of someone who'd decided something in the night and wasn't going to be argued out of it. "I work for my keep." Silas sat at the table. Didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Just ate the cornbread she put in front of him and tried to remember the last time food had tasted like something other than fuel to keep his body moving. It tasted like home. Like something he'd lost a long time ago and had given up hope of ever finding again. 5 days passed before Faith spoke more than a handful of words at a time. She worked with quiet purpose, cleaned what Silas hadn't touched in months, mended shirts he'd forgotten he even owned, swept the floor until you could actually see the boards underneath, washed the windows until light came through clean and bright, making the cabin look bigger than it was. She learned the rhythm of the land without needing to be told, knew when to feed the chickens, how to gather eggs without spooking the hens, where Silas kept the flour, and where he kept the coffee. Moved through the space like she was trying to earn her place one small task at a time. But something stayed locked behind her eyes, something that had been broken long before she walked into his cabin. Maybe in Ohio, working 12-hour days at a factory that didn't care if she lived or died. Maybe on the train west, building hope with every mile. Maybe at the depot, watching 2 days turn into 2 nights and no blue kerchief ever appearing. Or maybe it broke on that road, walking 40 miles on shoes that fell apart beneath her feet. Silas didn't push. He knew about things that broke inside a person, knew they healed slow if they healed at all, knew that sometimes the best thing you could do was just be present while someone put themselves back together piece by piece. On the 10th morning, she surprised him. "Mr. Silas," she said at breakfast, "may I plant some flowers by the porch?" He paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth. No one had asked him for anything in years, not even small things like flowers. People in town avoided him mostly, thought he was bitter, antisocial, maybe a little dangerous. Let him buy his supplies and leave without much conversation beyond what was necessary for commerce. He'd gotten used to it, preferred it even. But hearing her ask, hearing the careful politeness in her voice, like she was afraid he'd say no, it did something to him. "Plant what you want," he said. That afternoon, he watched her from the fence line, told himself he was fixing the fence post, that he had work to do and just happened to be doing it where he could see the porch. Told himself it was coincidence, nothing more. She knelt in the dirt with his old hand spade. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. She dug small holes with care, like each one mattered, like she was planting something more than flowers. Morning sun fell across her hair, turning it bronze. She hummed while she worked, a quiet sound, carried on the breeze. Some tune he didn't recognize, but that sounded like contentment, like maybe, just maybe, she was finding something here that resembled peace. Silas hammered the fence post, missed, hit his thumb instead, cursed under his breath. When he looked up, she was watching him. A smile played at the corner of her mouth, just a corner, just enough to let him know she'd seen him watching, that she knew he wasn't really fixing that fence post, that she understood exactly what he was doing and found it amusing. "Fence giving you trouble?" she called. Her voice carried across the yard. There was warmth in it, the first real warmth he'd heard from her since she'd arrived. "It's fine," he said, gruff. Embarrassed to have been caught, she turned back to her planting, but the smile stayed. That night, Faith set her valise into the corner of the front room and left it there. She didn't keep it beside her feet like she always had, didn't carry it from room to room like it was the only thing tethering her to the world, just left it resting against the wall, still there but no longer guarded. "I'm tired of carrying it," she said. Silas understood more than her words said. She was tired of carrying all of it, the lies, the broken promises, the 40 miles, the fear that she'd never belong anywhere again. Tired of holding herself together so tight that one wrong word might shatter her completely. He said nothing, didn't need to, just nodded and went back to reading, or pretending to read. The letters still swam on the page like they always did, his eyes never quite making sense of how they connected into words, but having the book open made him look occupied, gave him something to do with his hands. Faith sat across from him and took out her own sewing. They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low. Outside, the Montana sky turned dark and filled with more stars than anyone could count. I rode past that cabin every week on my mail route. Each time I saw more flowers growing by the porch, gold and purple blooms pushing through stubborn soil. Each time I wondered if Silas knew what was happening, if he understood that she wasn't just planting flowers, she was planting roots, making a home out of a place that had been just a house for too long. I wondered if he knew he was falling in love. I don't think he did. Not yet. But I could see it, clear as day. The way he looked at her when she wasn't watching. The way he found excuses to be near her, fixing things that weren't broken, checking on animals that didn't need checking. The way he smiled at something she said, then caught himself and wiped the smile away like it was evidence of weakness. Love doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Not out here. It starts quiet. Starts with cornbread and coffee and flowers planted by a porch. Starts with two people who've been alone too long, learning how to be near another person again without flinching. But I also knew it couldn't stay this simple. Nothing ever does in Montana. The territory demands its price from everyone, eventually. Makes you prove you really want what you're reaching for. Tests you until you either break or become stronger than you were. And this story was just beginning. 7 days after Faith planted her flowers, Silas rode into town. He needed supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork. The kind of things a man living alone could stretch for months, but that disappeared fast when there were 2 mouths to feed. He told himself that was the only reason he was going, that it had nothing to do with the way Faith had looked at the empty sugar tin that morning, then looked away without saying anything. But he bought sugar anyway. And when Pete Tucker asked him at the general store why he was buying twice his usual amount of everything, Silas found himself saying something he'd never said before. "Got someone helping at my place." The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign, like admitting to something he hadn't quite acknowledged, even to himself. Pete's eyebrows went up. "That right?" "She's working for her keep," Silas added quickly. Too quickly. "Cooking, cleaning. Fair trade." Pete nodded slow. His face stayed neutral, but Silas could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. By sunset, half the town would know. By tomorrow morning, the other half would have heard. Small towns don't keep secrets. They just decide which ones to talk about out loud and which ones to whisper about when certain people aren't listening. The following week, Faith asked if she could mail a letter. She'd written to a friend back in Ohio, a woman named Catherine who'd worked beside her at the factory. The letter was short. Faith showed it to Silas before sealing it, not because she had to, but because she wanted him to know she wasn't hiding anything. Dear Catherine, I arrived safely, though not where I expected. I've found work and shelter with a kind man named Silas McCrae. The Montana Territory is beautiful in ways I can't quite describe. Harder than Ohio, but honest. I think I may stay a while. Your friend Faith Silas read it twice. Noticed what she didn't say as much as what she did. Nothing about James Hollister, nothing about walking 40 miles, nothing about being abandoned at a depot like luggage no one bothered to claim. Just, I arrived safely. I can post it for you, he offered. Faith shook her head. I'd like to go to town, if that's all right. She said it carefully. The way she said everything, like she was always aware she was a guest, temporary, one wrong word away from being asked to leave. Silas looked at her, saw the way her hands twisted the letter, saw the tension in her shoulders. She was afraid. Not of town exactly, but of what town meant. People. Questions. Eyes that judged before knowing. We'll go together, he said. I knew about that trip before they made it. Pete Tucker told me Silas had been in buying supplies. Told me about someone helping at his place. Pete's wife told Martha Perkins at the church social. Martha told everyone else. By the time Silas and Faith rode into Willow Creek together, the whole town was primed and ready. They just didn't know what they were ready for. Faith felt the tension before they even saw the rooftops. She sat in front of Silas on the horse. He'd offered to hitch the wagon, but she'd said the horse was fine, probably because a wagon felt too formal, too much like announcing something she wasn't ready to announce. Her hands gripped the saddle horns so tight her knuckles had gone white. Nobody's going to bite you, Silas said gently. It was maybe the kindest thing he'd said to her directly. Not gruff or matter-of-fact, but actually gentle. Like he understood that going into town wasn't just about mailing a letter. It was about being seen, being judged, being reduced to whatever story people decided to tell about her before she'd even opened her mouth. Faith tried to smile. I know. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Town came slowly into view. A church steeple first, white paint peeling in strips like old skin. Then the general store, the saloon, the land office, the bank. A few horses tied outside the mercantile. People moving along the boardwalk, going about their business in the slow, deliberate way of folks who had nowhere urgent to be. As they rode down the main street, Faith felt every pair of eyes turned toward them. A woman in a blue bonnet stopped mid-step, her mouth falling open. Two men outside the saloon nudged each other and stared. A child pointed before his mother pulled his hand down and whispered something sharp in his ear. Silas felt Faith's back go rigid against his chest. They dismounted outside the general store. Silas tied the horse. Faith smoothed her dress, a simple gray thing she'd mended herself, nothing fancy but clean and respectable. She'd pinned her hair up that morning with more care than usual, wanted to look proper, wanted to look like she belonged. The bell jingled when they stepped inside. 3 women turned at once. The talking stopped. Every pair of eyes settled on Faith with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for coyotes spotted near the chicken coop. Assessing, calculating, deciding whether this was a threat or just a curiosity. Martha Perkins stood behind the counter. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, the kind who'd been beautiful once and hadn't quite forgiven time for taking that away. Her smile was sweet as honey, but her eyes were sharp as pins. "Well now," Martha said. Her voice carried across the store like a preacher's on Sunday. "Silas McCrae, been a while." She let the silence hang for just a beat too long. Then her gaze slid to Faith. And who might this be? Silas felt his neck heat up. He hadn't wanted this trip, hadn't wanted to put Faith in front of watchful eyes so soon, but she'd asked, and he'd said yes, and now, here they were. "She's helping at my place," Silas said. His voice came out stiffer than he'd intended, defensive. He hated how it sounded, like he was making excuses, justifying something that didn't need justification. "Helping," Martha repeated. She tasted the word like it was something she needed to test for poison before swallowing. Faith met her stare with quiet strength, lifted her chin just a fraction, not defiant exactly, but not apologizing either. "Good morning, ma'am," Faith said. Her voice was steady, polite. The voice of someone who knew she was being judged and had decided she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Martha blinked, thrown off just for a second by Faith's composure. "Good morning," the other women whispered behind their hands. One of them, a thin woman with a pinched face, leaned close to her companion and said something that made them both look at Faith with expressions that were equal parts pity and scandal. Faith walked to the counter, placed her letter down. "I'd like to post this, please." Martha took it, read the address, Cincinnati, Ohio. Her eyebrows went up just a fraction. "Long way from home," Martha observed. "Yes, ma'am." Martha set the letter aside, named a price. Faith paid with coins she'd earned doing mending work for Silas. He'd insisted on paying her something, even though she'd protested, said if she was working, she deserved wages. The transaction complete, Faith turned to leave. Behind her she heard it. Low voices, not quite whispered, meant to be overheard. "Mail order bride," one woman said. "That's what I heard. Left at the depot like unwanted baggage." Another voice chimed in. "Living with Silas now. Alone." Then laughter, low and knowing. The kind of laughter that draws a line between the respectable and the fallen, and makes sure everyone knows which side they're on. Faith's shoulders tensed, but she kept walking. She didn't say a word, didn't look back, didn't give them the reaction they were fishing for. Silas followed her out. The bell jingled behind them, cheerful and oblivious. Outside, Faith stood on the boardwalk. Her jaw had gone tight. Her hands were fists at her sides. "Faith, I'm fine." But she wasn't. He could see that. Could see the way she was holding herself together by sheer force of will, the way a dam holds back water, one crack away from everything breaking loose. They rode home in silence. Dust rose behind the horses' hooves. The valley spread wide and empty around them. Sky so big it made the town feel small in comparison. Made the whispers feel smaller too, though Silas knew that distance didn't make them matter less. Halfway home, Faith finally spoke. "They think I'm a fallen woman living in sin." Her voice didn't shake. It was too steady. The kind of steady that comes from holding everything so tight, you're afraid if you loosen your grip even a little, you'll fly apart completely. "I know what they think." Silas kept his eyes on the road. "Doesn't change what's true." She looked at him, really looked, like she was seeing him for the first time, or maybe seeing him clearly for the first time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me stand my ground." He nodded, didn't know what else to say. But something passed between them in that moment, something that didn't need words, an understanding, a solidarity. Two people who'd both been judged and found wanting by folks who didn't know the first thing about them. Two people learning to stand together. Let me tell you about Eleanor Walsh. She was watching from the boarding house window when Silas and Faith rode into town that day. Watched the whole thing unfold. The stares, the whispers, the way Faith held herself like a queen, even though she was wearing a mended dress and shoes that had seen better days. Eleanor recognized that posture. She'd worn it herself 5 years ago when she'd arrived in Willow Creek. A widow with no family, and a story that didn't quite add up. Her husband had died, she said, left her the boarding house in his will. That much was true. What she didn't say was that her husband had been a gambler and a drunk, that she'd worked in a saloon in Denver before marrying him, that respectable women like Martha Perkins took one look at her and decided she was trouble, the kind that wore rouge and laughed too loud and probably deserved whatever bad things happened to her. It had taken Eleanor 3 years to build enough respectability to run her boarding house without constant whispers following her down the street. She'd done it by keeping her head down, by being useful, by never giving them ammunition. But watching Faith, young and proud, and refusing to shrink, Eleanor felt something stir, something she'd buried 3 years ago in the name of survival, courage, or maybe just the memory of what it felt like to stand up straight. She made a decision right then. Next time she saw Faith, she'd speak to her, maybe offer friendship, maybe just offer a kind word in a town that seemed determined to offer nothing but judgment. It was a small decision, but small decisions have a way of changing everything. That evening, Silas found Faith in the garden. She was deadheading the flowers she'd planted, pulling off the spent blooms with careful fingers. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything gold and amber. Her hair had come loose from its pins. It hung around her shoulders in waves, catching the light. She looked up when she heard him approach. "I'm sorry about today," he said. Faith shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Still, shouldn't have let them talk like that. What would you have done? Challenged them to a duel over my honor?" There was a hint of humor in her voice, dry and tired. But there. Silas almost smiled. Might have. She did smile then, small, but real. "I've been talked about before," she said. "Factory girls aren't exactly celebrated for their virtue. We're poor, we work with our hands, we don't have families to protect our reputations. People assume things." She pulled another dead bloom, dropped it in her basket. "I learned a long time ago that what people think doesn't change who I am. It just changes what they see when they look at me." Silas studied her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way she held herself even now, after everything, after being lied to, abandoned, walked 40 miles, gossiped about by strangers. "You're stronger than most men I know," he said quietly. Faith looked at him then. Something shifted in her expression, softened. "So are you." They stood in the garden as the sun dropped lower. Neither moved, neither spoke. But something hummed in the air between them, something new and fragile and terrifying in its possibility. Finally, Faith broke the silence. "Teach me to shoot." Silas blinked. "What?" "A gun. Teach me. If I'm going to live out here, I should know how." It was practical, sensible. Women on the frontier needed to know how to protect themselves, nothing romantic about it at all. Except the way she looked at him when she asked, the way she waited for his answer like it mattered. "Tomorrow," Silas said. "I'll teach you tomorrow." The next afternoon they walked to the clearing behind the cabin. Silas brought his rifle and his pistol, figured she should learn both, though the pistol would be easier for her to handle. Set up tin cans on a fallen log about 20 paces out. Faith watched everything he did with focused attention, asked questions, listened to the answers. When he handed her the pistol, she took it carefully, held it like it was a living thing that might bite if she wasn't respectful. "It's heavier than I thought," she said. "That's the weight of what it can do." He showed her how to stand, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger slow instead of jerking it. Then he stood behind her, adjusted her stance with his hands on her shoulders, guided her arms into position. That's when he felt it, the awareness, the way her breath caught when he touched her, the way his own pulse kicked up a notch, the sudden, overwhelming consciousness of how close they were, how easy it would be to lean forward just a fraction, how her hair smelled like soap and wood smoke. Faith went very still. The air between them felt charged, electric. "Like this?" she asked. Her voice had gone soft, almost breathless. "Yeah," Silas managed. "Just like that." He stepped back, put distance between them before he did something stupid, something that would complicate everything. Faith fired, missed the can by a mile. But she was grinning when she turned around, exhilarated, alive. "Again," she said. They spent an hour in that clearing. By the end, she'd hit 3 cans. Not bad for a first lesson. Walking back, Faith said, "You're a good teacher. Never taught anyone anything before." You're patient, that matters. She glanced at him sideways. There's something I should tell you. I can't read very well. Silas stopped walking. Faith kept her eyes forward. Never went to school past 8 years old. Had to work. I can read simple things, but anything complicated. She shrugged. I struggle. That why you asked me to read your letter before you sealed it? Yes. She said it simply. No shame, but no pride either. Just fact. They walked a few more steps in silence. Then Silas said, I can't read at all. Faith looked at him sharply. Never learned, he continued. My mother tried to teach me when I was young, but the letters they don't make sense in my head. They swim around. I can write my name. That's about it. He'd never told anyone that before. It was a secret he'd guarded for 20 years. Let people think he just preferred not to read, that he was uninterested, not incapable. But standing there with Faith, who just trusted him with her own vulnerability, he found himself trusting her back. I could teach you, Faith said softly. You just said you can't read much yourself. I can read enough, and 2 people who struggle are better than 1 person alone. She smiled at him, warm and genuine. We could learn together. That night they sat at the table with the only book in Silas's cabin, a Bible his mother had owned. Faith opened it to the Psalms because the words were shorter there, simpler. She pointed to letters, sounded them out slow. Silas repeated after her, his voice halting and uncertain. When he finally got through a whole sentence, "The Lord is my shepherd," Faith beamed at him like he'd roped the moon. "You did it!" Silas felt something warm spread through his chest, something that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with the way she looked at him, like he was capable, like he was more than his limitations, like he mattered. 3 days later, I delivered a letter to Silas's cabin. Legal notice, official seal, the kind of letter that never brings good news. Silas read the address, or tried to, then handed it to Faith. She opened it, read it twice. Her face went pale. "What is it?" Silas asked. "It's about your brother." Robert McCrae had died in San Francisco. Gambling dispute. Someone had put a knife in his ribs over a card game, and he'd bled out in an alley behind a saloon. The letter was from an estate administrator. Robert's personal effects were being sent to his next of kin. Silas didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, holding the letter, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry," Faith said quietly. "Don't be." His voice was flat. He made his choices. But I could see it in his eyes. Could see the complicated tangle of grief and anger and relief. You can hate someone and still mourn them, can be glad they're gone and still wish things had been different. Family does that to you. The administrator is sending his belongings, Faith said, still reading. Should arrive within the month. Silas nodded, folded the letter, put it in his pocket. That night he didn't come to the reading lesson. Faith found him outside, sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the valley. She sat beside him, didn't speak, just sat. After a while, Silas said, "He wasn't always like that. Robert." His voice was rough, like the words had to scrape their way out. "When we were kids, he was my best friend. Protected me when other boys made fun of me for not being able to read. Taught me to ride, to rope, to shoot." Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then our parents died, and something in him changed, got hard, got greedy. Started seeing everything as something to profit from." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking, maybe if I'd been different, smarter, better at the business side of ranching, maybe he wouldn't have felt like he had to—" "No," Faith interrupted. Her voice was firm. "You don't get to take responsibility for his choices." She shifted to face him. "I spent 6 months blaming myself for James Hollister's lies, wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done different. But the truth is, some people lie, some people take advantage, and it's not our fault for believing them." Her hand found his in the darkness. "You are not your brother, just like I am not his victim. Not anymore." Silas looked at their joined hands. Her fingers were small and pale against his calloused palm. He didn't pull away. They sat like that until the stars came out. until the valley went quiet except for crickets and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. The crate arrived 2 weeks later. I delivered it myself. Heavy wooden box with Robert's name stenciled on the side. Took 2 of us to get it off the wagon. Silas stared at it for a long time before opening it. Faith stood beside him, offering silent support. I tipped my hat and left them to it. Some moments are private, even when you're the one who delivered them. Inside the crate, a pocket watch that had belonged to their father, some clothes, a Derringer pistol, and a leather-bound ledger. Silas opened the ledger. His hands started shaking. Faith took it from him, read the first few pages. Her face went white. "What is it?" Silas asked, though part of him already knew. "It's a record," Faith said slowly, "of transactions." She flipped through more pages. Names, dates, amounts of money, cities, and then she found it. A section labeled Bride Scheme, multiple entries, multiple women, multiple territories. Faith's name was there. Faith Garrett, Cincinnati, Ohio. Next to it, $42 train fare collected. Below her name, 11 others, all partnerships between Robert McCrae and James Hollister. "Oh, God," Faith whispered. She sank down onto a chair. The ledger fell from her hands onto the table. Silas picked it up, couldn't read the words, but he could see the numbers, could see the careful accounting, could see proof that his brother and the man who'd lied to Faith had been in business together, had been running this scheme for years. Faith wasn't just unlucky, she'd been targeted, chosen, processed like merchandise. And Silas's brother had helped make it happen. The betrayal compounded, layered. Robert hadn't just sold the land. He'd participated in something cruel and calculated. Had victimized women, 12 of them at least, for profit. Silas felt sick. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, pathetic. Faith looked up at him, tears in her eyes, but not falling. Never falling. "You didn't know. He was my brother, and that makes it worse for you, not me." She stood, crossed to him, put her hands on his face and made him look at her. "Listen to me, Silas McCrae. You are not responsible for what he did. You are not him. You are the man who stopped in a storm, who gave me shelter, who's teaching me to shoot and learning to read and making me feel like maybe I can belong somewhere again." Her voice broke on the last word. "You are good. Do you hear me? You are good." Silas pulled her close, held her while she finally let herself cry, felt her tears soak into his shirt, felt her shake with everything she'd been holding in since the moment she'd opened that valise and shown him those letters. And he held her, because he didn't know what else to do, because she needed to be held, because somewhere along the way she'd stopped being a stranger he'd rescued in a storm and become someone he couldn't imagine living without. That was the night everything changed between them. Not in the way you might think. There was no kiss, no declaration, just 2 broken people holding each other in a cabin in Montana, learning that sometimes the worst betrayals lead you to the people who'll help you heal. The next morning, Faith made a decision. "I want to confront him," she said at breakfast. "James Hollister." Silas looked up from his coffee. "You sure?" "I need to look him in the eye. I need him to know that I survived, that I'm not just a name in his ledger." She set her jaw, determined. "Will you come with me?" Silas didn't hesitate. "Yes." 3 days later, they rode into town together. This time Faith didn't twist her handkerchief, didn't sit rigid in the saddle. She sat straight and purposeful, like a woman going into battle. They dismounted outside the mercantile. Faith walked in alone. She'd asked Silas to wait outside, said this was something she needed to do herself. I was there, saw the whole thing. James Hollister stood behind the counter. His face drained of color when he saw her, went white as fresh milk. Faith walked right up to him, set the ledger on the counter, opened it to the page with her name. "I have your letters, mister." "Hollister," she said. Her voice was calm, cold as a Montana winter. "All of them, including the ones you wrote to Robert McCrae." James's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. His wife Sarah was in the back room, stepped out when she heard voices, saw the ledger, saw her husband's face. Faith Garrett, Faith continued. Cincinnati, Ohio, $42 for train fare. That's what you wrote. Like I was a purchase, like I was inventory. She leaned forward. I walked 40 miles on your lies, Mr. Hollister. 40 miles through country that didn't care if I lived or died. I want you to know that I survived them. She placed a single letter on the counter, one of his letters to Robert, discussing the scheme, talking about women like they were livestock. Then she turned and walked out. Behind her, Sarah Hollister's voice rose, sharp, demanding answers. James stammered, made excuses. The sound of it followed Faith out onto the boardwalk. Outside, Silas was waiting. So was Eleanor Walsh. Eleanor had been across the street when they'd arrived. She'd watched Faith walk into the Mercantile with her head high and her spine straight. Had watched her walk out the same way, with James Hollister's world crumbling behind her. I saw, Eleanor said quietly. I heard. She looked at Faith with understanding in her eyes. You were magnificent. Faith's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off, but she was standing. Thank you, she managed. Eleanor glanced at Silas, then back to Faith. I run the boarding house on 3rd Street. If you ever need anything, a friend, a cup of tea, somewhere to sit that isn't full of judgment, my door is open. It was an offer of alliance, of solidarity. Faith nodded. I'd like that. Behind the Mercantile's window, they could see Sarah Hollister pointing at her husband, see James's hands raised, pleading. The truth was out, not all of it, not yet, but enough. Martha Perkins had been in the back room too. She'd heard everything. And Martha Perkins, for all her faults, had a conscience. What happened in that Mercantile would spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By sunset, everyone would know. They rode home in silence. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not heavy with judgment or shame, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air feels clean and new. Halfway home, Faith started to cry. Not sobbing, just tears running down her face while she stared straight ahead. I thought I'd feel better, she said. I thought confronting him would make it stop hurting. Does it? A little. Maybe. I don't know. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I just keep thinking about the other 11 women. Where are they? Did they survive? Did they walk 40 miles too, or did they give up? Did anyone find them? Silas didn't have answers. Sometimes there aren't any. Sometimes all you can do is survive your own story and hope that somehow, somewhere, others survive theirs too. That night, Faith burned the last of the physical letters, the ones James had written to Robert, watched them curl and blacken in the stove. But she kept the ledger. Evidence, she said, in case anyone ever needs it. Silas understood. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting the other women, the ones whose names were written in that book, the ones who might still need proof that what happened to them wasn't their fault. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the valley. Faith leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, a small gesture but significant. Thank you for standing with me, she said. Always will. The promise hung in the air between them, simple, honest. Neither of them knew how soon it would be tested, because trouble was coming. The kind that doesn't announce itself with letters or ledgers. The kind that arrives in the middle of the night with guns and accusations. 2 nights later, I was at the saloon when I heard the news. Bank in Willow Creek had been robbed. 4 men, faces covered, came in just before closing. Cleaned out the safe, shot the lock off, took everything, rode out toward the mountains. By morning, the whole territory was talking about it, and by afternoon, people started asking questions. Who'd been in town recently? Who'd been acting strange? Who had motive? Old Jenkins, half blind, half senile, but still convinced he was useful, told the sheriff he'd seen a woman near the bank that night. Dark hair, he said, wearing a gray dress. Looked like that girl staying with Silas McCrae. I heard about it from Pete Tucker. Pete pulled me aside after making a delivery. "Wilbur," he said, his voice low, "you should tell Silas. Sheriff's going to come asking questions. Jenkins is stirring up talk." My stomach dropped, because I knew what this meant. Faith had been in town twice in the last month, both times wearing a gray dress, the only nice one she owned, both times with dark hair pinned up just like Jenkins described. The fact that Jenkins couldn't see worth a damn didn't matter. Fear doesn't care about truth, and a town afraid is a dangerous thing. I rode out to Silas's cabin that evening, had to warn them, had to tell them that everything they'd been building, all that fragile peace, was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. Because sometimes the story isn't about whether you're innocent, it's about whether anyone believes you. I reached the cabin just as the sun was setting. Silas was chopping wood behind the house. Faith was hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between two posts. Domestic. Peaceful. The kind of scene that makes you forget how quickly peace can shatter. They both looked up when they heard my horse. One look at my face and Silas set down the axe. "What's wrong?" I dismounted slow, tried to figure out how to say it, how to warn them that everything was about to fall apart through no fault of their own. "Bank got robbed 2 nights ago," I said. 4 men, cleaned out the safe." Silas nodded. "Heard about it in town last week. What's that got to do with us?" Jenkins told the sheriff he saw a woman near the bank that night. Dark hair, gray dress. Faith's hands stopped mid-motion, a wet shirt hanging from her fingers. "He's describing you," I said quietly. "Sheriff's going to come asking questions, maybe more than questions." The shirt dropped back into the basket. Faith's face had gone pale. "I wasn't anywhere near town that night," she said. "I was here. We both were. I know that, you know that. But Jenkins," I shook my head, man's half-blind on a good day, "saw something he thought was suspicious and filled in the rest with his imagination. And now the whole town's afraid. Folks are looking for someone to blame." Silas stepped forward. "They can't accuse her without proof." "They can accuse anyone they want, Silas. Proof comes later, if it comes at all." I saw the way he straightened, the way his jaw set, protective, ready to fight. "What should we do?" Faith asked. Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She'd already been judged once by this town, already been whispered about and looked at sideways. Now they were going to accuse her of robbery? "Stay close to home," I said. "Don't give them any reason to—" I didn't get to finish, because that's when we heard the horses. Sheriff Thomas Harlan rode up with 2 deputies flanking him. His face was carved from stone, the kind of expression that meant he'd made a decision and wasn't looking to be talked out of it. Behind them I could see more men, town council members, Pete Tucker, looking miserable. A few others I recognized from the saloon, a posse. My heart sank. "Silas," the sheriff said by way of greeting. His eyes moved to Faith. "Miss Garrett?" "Sheriff," Silas replied. His voice had gone cold, flat. "What brings you out here?" "You know what brings me." Harlan dismounted, stood with his hands loose at his sides, not threatening, but ready. "Need to ask Miss Garrett some questions about her whereabouts 2 nights ago." "She was here," Silas said immediately. "All night. Never left." "That so?" The sheriff's eyes never left Faith. "You can confirm that, ma'am?" Faith nodded. "I was here. We had supper together. Then I mended some shirts by the fire. We went to bed around 9. "Anyone else see you? Anyone who can verify?" Silence. Because, of course, there wasn't anyone else. It was just the 2 of them out here. That's what made it safe. That's what made it home. And that's what made it impossible to prove. "Jenkins says he saw a woman matching your description near the bank around 10 o'clock that night," Harlan continued. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't sympathetic either, just doing his job, following the law wherever it led, even if he didn't like where it was going. "Jenkins can't see 10 feet in front of his face," Silas said sharply. "Maybe so, but he's not the only one. Rachel Morrison saw someone too, said she couldn't make out the face, but the build was right. The hair color, the dress." Faith's hands had started to shake. She clasped them together to hide it. "Sheriff, you know this is nonsense," I said, stepping forward. Faith Garrett's been out here for weeks. She's not a criminal." "Not saying she is," Harlan replied, "but I've got witnesses placing someone who looks like her at the scene. I've got a town that's scared and angry and looking for answers, and I've got a job to do." He looked at Faith with something that might have been regret. "Miss Garrett, I'm going to need you to come with me." "No," Silas said. One word, hard as iron. The deputies' hands moved toward their guns, not drawing, but ready. "Silas," Harlan said slowly, "don't make this harder than it has to be." "You're arresting her, on the word of a half-blind old man?" "I'm taking her in for questioning. What happens after that depends on what we find out." He looked past Silas to Faith. "Ma'am, you can come willing, or you can come in irons. Your choice, but you're coming." The valley went quiet. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Faith stepped forward. "It's all right, Silas." Her voice was calm, calmer than it had any right to be. She walked toward the sheriff with her head high, her shoulders back. Every inch of her radiating dignity, even as her world fell apart around her for the second time in as many months. "I'll come peacefully," she said to Harlan. "I have nothing to hide." Silas caught her arm. "Faith," she looked at him, put her hand over his. "I'll be fine. The truth will come out." But we both heard the tremor underneath those words, the fear she was trying so hard not to show. They put her on a horse. Not in irons, Harlan had that much decency, but surrounded by deputies like she was dangerous, like she might bolt. Silas watched them ride away with murder in his eyes. When they were out of sight, he turned to me. "Wilbur, I need your help." I'd known Silas McCrae since he was 14 years old, had delivered the letter telling him his mother was dying, had carried the news of his father's passing 3 months later, had watched him survive winters that should have killed him, had seen him weather his brother's betrayal and the town's judgment, and 5 years of loneliness that would have broken most men. But I'd never seen him look the way he looked right then, desperate, determined, dangerous. "What do you need?" I asked. "Everything you know about that robbery, every detail. And I need to know where those men rode after, which direction, how many horses, anything." "Silas, that's the sheriff's job. The sheriff just arrested an innocent woman because the town's afraid and needs someone to blame. I'm not waiting for him to figure out he's wrong." He grabbed his rifle from the cabin, started loading his saddlebag with supplies. "If they rode toward the mountains, there's only 3 ways through. I know this country better than anyone. I can find their trail. I can find proof. And if you can't," he stopped, looked at me, "then I'll tear this territory apart until I do." They put Faith in a cell in the back of the sheriff's office. It was a small room, barely bigger than a closet. 1 window, bars across it, a cot with a thin mattress and a blanket that had seen better days. A bucket in the corner for necessities. Faith sat on the cot and tried not to shake. She'd been in small spaces before. The boarding house room she'd rented in Cincinnati had been cramped. The train car had been crowded. But those places had doors that opened, windows she could look through and see the world beyond. This was different. This was a cage. Sheriff Harlan stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. "I'm sorry about this, Miss Garrett." Faith looked at him. "Are you?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I am, but I've got a job to do. Town's frightened. They need to see I'm taking this seriously." "So you arrest the easiest target? The outsider? The woman everyone's already decided is suspicious? That's not—" He stopped, sighed. "Look, I don't think you did this. I really don't. But I have to follow procedure, have to investigate." "How long will I be here?" "Until I can prove you're innocent. Or until—" He didn't finish. Until they proved she was guilty. Faith wrapped her arms around herself. "May I have some water?" Harlan brought her a cup from the office. Handed it through the bars like she was an animal that might bite. "I'll send someone to check on you in the morning," he said. "You need anything, you call out." Then he left, locked the door behind him. Faith sat in the gathering darkness and listened to the sounds of the town beyond her window. Voices, laughter from the saloon, a dog barking, normal sounds from a normal evening. Life going on while hers stopped. She thought about the letters she'd burned, about James Hollister's lies, About walking 40 miles only to end up here, in a jail cell, accused of a crime she didn't commit. For a moment, just a moment, she wondered if it would have been better to have died on that road, to have laid down in the mud and let the rain take her, to have never made it to Silas's cabin, never planted flowers, never learned to hope again. Then she thought of Silas's face when she'd left, the way he'd looked at her, the promise in his eyes. And she decided that no, it wouldn't have been better. Because even if this ended badly, even if the town found her guilty and hanged her for something she didn't do, she'd had those weeks. She'd had cornbread and coffee and reading lessons. She'd had someone look at her like she mattered. That was more than she'd had before. It would have to be enough. That night, Eleanor Walsh waited until full dark. Then she slipped out of her boarding house with a basket covered by a cloth, walked the back streets until she reached the sheriff's office, knocked on the window of Faith's cell. Faith startled awake. She'd been dozing fitfully, her body exhausted, but her mind too wound up to truly rest. "Who's there?" "Eleanor Walsh, from the boarding house. I brought you something." Faith came to the window. Eleanor passed the basket through the bars, had to angle it just right to fit. Inside, bread, cheese, apples, a small jar of honey, clean handkerchiefs, a book. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Eleanor interrupted. "I know what it's like to be alone in this town, to have everyone decide who you are before you've even opened your mouth." She looked at Faith through the bars. Two women separated by iron but connected by something deeper. "I was working in a saloon in Denver when I met my husband," Eleanor said quietly. "He was a gambler, a drunk. But he was kind to me, and that was rare enough that I married him. When he died, he left me the boarding house here. His family back east contested the will, said I'd manipulated him. Town assumed I must have been his mistress, not his wife." She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Took me 3 years to convince them otherwise. 3 years of keeping my head down and my mouth shut and never giving them ammunition. I survived by being invisible." She reached through the bars and took Faith's hand. "But watching you walk into that mercantile, watching you face down James Hollister with your head high, you reminded me that survival isn't the same as living." "I'm not sure surviving is an option anymore," Faith said softly. "It is, because you have people fighting for you. Silas is out there right now looking for proof. And you have me. I'll come every night. I'll bring you food. I'll be your eyes and ears out here." "Why? Why risk your reputation for me?" Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Because 5 years ago, no one did it for me. And I've regretted that loneliness every day since." Silas rode hard toward the mountains. He'd stopped at Pete Tucker's place first, woken him up, demanded to know everything he'd heard about the robbery. Pete, feeling guilty about not speaking up louder when Faith was arrested, told him what he knew. 4 men, horses heading northeast. One witness thought they'd heard someone say, "Ridgewater," right before they rode out. Could be a town, could be a landmark. Pete wasn't sure. I'd told Silas everything I knew too, had even offered to come with him, but he'd refused. "Need you here," he'd said. "Need you to keep an eye on Faith. Make sure they're treating her right. If anything happens to her," he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Now he was alone in the wilderness, following a trail that was 3 days cold, looking for tracks that rain might have washed away, searching for men who didn't want to be found. But Silas knew this country, had hunted it, trapped it, survived in it when most men would have died. He knew where the passes were, where you could hide, where you'd have to go if you wanted to disappear. He found the first sign at dawn on the second day. Hoof prints near a stream. 4 horses, one with a distinctive nick in the left front shoe. They'd stopped here to water the animals, then headed up into the high country. Silas followed. Back in town, things were getting complicated. The morning after Faith's arrest, a man arrived on the noon stage, tall, well-dressed, carrying himself with the kind of authority that said he was used to being obeyed. He checked into Eleanor's boarding house and introduced himself as Mr. Vernon Ashford, representative of the Northern Pacific Railroad. He had business with Silas McCrae. Eleanor sent word to me immediately. I rode out to the cabin, found it empty. Silas still gone, searching. But I found the letters, 2 of them, official-looking. One I delivered a month ago. The other must have come while I was sick with fever, carried by the backup courier. Both from the railroad. Both claiming that the land transfer from Samuel Pritchard to Silas's father was invalid. That the railroad had purchased Pritchard's claim from his heirs before his death, making them the rightful owners. That Silas had 30 days to vacate, or they'd bring legal action. The 30 days were almost up. I took the letters to town, found Mr. Ashford at the boarding house, having coffee in Eleanor's parlor like he owned the place. "Mr. Ashford," I said, "I'm Wilbur Crane, mail carrier. I have information about the McCrae property." He looked at me with polite disinterest. "Yes?" "Silas McCrae is currently away, but I know he's been trying to contact Samuel Pritchard's sister back east to get documentation proving the land transfer was legitimate. I'm sure Mr. McCrae can present whatever documentation he has at the hearing," Ashford said smoothly. "We've scheduled it for 3 days from now. 10 o'clock, County Courthouse." "That's the same time as—" I stopped. "The same time they'd scheduled Faith's hearing." Ashford smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, unfortunate timing, but these things happen." I didn't like this man. Didn't like his smile or his timing or the way he looked at Eleanor's boarding house like he was calculating its value. But more than that, I didn't like the coincidence. Silas's woman accused of robbery. His land threatened. Both crises happening at once. That wasn't coincidence. That was orchestration. That night I went to the saloon, found Pete Tucker nursing a whiskey in the corner, sat down across from him. "Pete, you know anything about Vernon Ashford?" Pete glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Railroad man, been sniffing around the territory for months, trying to buy up land for a new line they want to run through the valley." "And Silas's land?" "Prime location. Water rights, access to the pass, good timber. Railroad wants it bad. Made Silas an offer last year through an intermediary. Silas refused." Pete took a drink. "Word is, Ashford doesn't take no for an answer. Man's got a reputation. Folks who don't sell to him tend to have problems. Property disputes, debts called in, accidents." "You think he's behind Faith's arrest?" Pete looked at me like I'd finally caught up. "I think it's mighty convenient that Silas's woman gets locked up right when he's supposed to be fighting to keep his land. I think it's mighty convenient that the hearing's the same day. Forces him to choose, defend her or defend the property. That's dirty? Yeah, but legal. And Ashford's good at staying just on the right side of legal." I felt something cold settle in my gut. "Pete, who was Robert McCrae's partner before he died?" Pete frowned. "What do you mean?" "In San Francisco. The gambling dispute that got him killed. Who was he working with?" Pete thought about it. "Heard something about that. Robert was running some scheme, trying to get investors for a railroad venture. Had a business partner. Fancy man from back east." He snapped his fingers, trying to remember. Ashford! Vernon Ashford, that was the name. Everything clicked into place. Robert and Ashford had been partners. Robert knew about the land, knew it was valuable, knew Silas wouldn't sell. Robert had also been partners with James Hollister in the bride scheme. And now, Robert was dead, but Ashford was here, trying to get the land, using every dirty trick in the book, including framing Faith to distract Silas. I stood up so fast my chair fell over. "Where are you going?" Pete asked. "To the sheriff. He needs to know what's really happening here." But when I got to the sheriff's office, Harlan was gone. Out to Ridgewater, his deputy said, following a lead on the bank robbery. I'd have to wait. Silas found them on the 3rd day. Holed up in an abandoned mining camp in the high country. 4 men, just like the witnesses said, horses tied outside a half-collapsed cabin. He watched from the ridge above, counting heads, looking for weaknesses. They were passing around a bottle, celebrating, laughing about something. Silas waited until dark. Then he worked his way down the slope, silent as smoke. Got close enough to hear them talking. "Easiest money we ever made," one man was saying. "Ashford pays better than bank robbery, And we don't even have to keep the cash. Already gave it back to him." Another man laughed. "Stupid sheriff thinks he's looking for real thieves. Never gonna figure out it was staged." Silas's blood went cold. "That girl they arrested," a third man said. "She the one Ashford wanted framed?" "Yep, McCrae's woman. Ashford said getting her locked up would keep McCrae busy. Can't fight a land claim when you're trying to prove your woman didn't rob a bank." They laughed again. Silas had heard enough. He stepped out of the shadows, rifle leveled. "Don't move." 4 men froze. Hands moved toward guns. "Try it," Silas said, his voice deadly calm. "Give me a reason." The smart one, the one who'd mentioned Ashford's name, slowly raised his hands. "Easy, friend. We're just having a drink. You're confessing to robbery and conspiracy, and you're going to do it again, in front of a judge." "Like hell we are." The youngest one, couldn't have been more than 20, went for his gun. Silas shot him in the shoulder before the kid's gun cleared leather. The others didn't move after that. Sheriff Harlan arrived at the mining camp the next morning with his deputies. Found Silas sitting on a rock, rifle across his knees, 4 men tied up and nursing various injuries, one with a shoulder wound, another with a broken nose, all of them looking significantly less confident than they had the night before. "Silas," Harlan said wearily, "what did you do?" "Found your bank robbers, and found out who paid them to do it." Silas stood, looked Harlan dead in the eye. "Vernon Ashford hired them to stage the robbery and frame Faith. Wanted me distracted while he stole my land. These men will testify to it." "Like hell we will," one of them muttered. Silas walked over to him, looked down at him with the kind of cold fury that makes smart men nervous. "You'll testify, or I'll make sure every territorial marshal from here to California knows you were working for Ashford. Make sure the railroad finds out you were running side schemes. Make sure you've got nowhere to run and no one to protect you." He crouched down to eye level. "Choose." The man swallowed hard, looked at his companions, looked back at Silas. "We'll testify." They rode back to Willow Creek in a procession, sheriff in front, 4 prisoners in the middle, hands bound, Silas bringing up the rear, rifle still ready. It took 2 days. By the time they arrived, the whole town had heard. Word had spread, the way it always does in small places, that Silas McCrae had tracked down the real criminals, that Faith Garrett was innocent, that something bigger and darker was happening. Eleanor met them at the edge of town. She'd been waiting, watching. When she saw Silas, she ran to him. "Faith?" "Still locked up," Eleanor said, "but I've been with her every night. She's holding on." "Ashford?" "Still here, still acting like he owns the place. Hearings tomorrow morning." Silas dismounted, handed his horse to Eleanor. "Take care of him. I need to see Faith." But when he got to the sheriff's office, Harlan stopped him. "Can't let you in yet, Silas. Not until this is official. Not until we've got their statements documented." "Tom, I know, but I have to do this right. If Ashford's as connected as you say, he'll find any excuse to get this thrown out on procedure. I need everything airtight." Silas wanted to argue, wanted to push past him and see Faith, hold her, tell her it was almost over, but Harlan was right. They had to do this right. "How long?" "Few hours, maybe less. Soon as I get their statements, I'll release her." Silas nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. "Tom, there's more. Robert was Ashford's partner. That's how Ashford knew about the land. Robert must have told him before he died." Harlan's face went grim. "Ashford's staying at the Walsh boarding house. I'll have deputies watching him. Make sure he doesn't run before the hearing." That night, Martha Perkins couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to her husband, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Faith Garrett sitting in that cell, thinking about the way she'd judged her, the way she'd whispered about her with the other women, the way she'd assumed the worst because it was easier than questioning her own righteousness. James Hollister's wife had come to see her that afternoon. Sarah, her eyes red from crying, her world shattered. "I didn't know," Sarah had said. "All those letters he was getting, all those trips to town for business. I didn't know he was lying to women, taking their money, ruining their lives." She'd shown Martha the ledger, the one Faith had left at the mercantile, the proof of James's crimes. 12 women. Sarah had whispered. 12 lives destroyed. And I was married to the man who did it. Martha had read the names, read the amounts. Read the cold, calculating notes about which women were most vulnerable, most likely to send money, most likely to get on a train for a promise that didn't exist. It had made her sick, and it had made her realize something. Faith Garrett hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't done anything except trust and hope and try to build a new life. And Martha had judged her for it, had whispered about her, had made her feel unwelcome in a town that should have offered shelter. Martha got out of bed, dressed quietly so she wouldn't wake her husband. She had something to do. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the next morning. By 9, the courthouse was packed. Everyone in Willow Creek wanted to see this, wanted to know what would happen to Faith Garrett, to Silas McCrae's land, to Vernon Ashford. I was there early, saved seats for Eleanor and Pete Tucker. Faith was brought in at 9:30, flanked by deputies. She looked thin, tired, but her spine was straight. Her head was high. Silas was already there, sitting in the front row. When Faith walked in, their eyes met. Everything they'd been through, everything they'd survived, everything they meant to each other, it was all there in that look. Faith's lips trembled, just for a second. Then she smiled, small but real. Silas smiled back. Vernon Ashford arrived at 9:45, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase, looking every inch the successful businessman. He nodded to people he recognized, shook hands, played the part of the respectable railroad representative. He saw Silas, and his smile widened. "Mr. McCrae, I trust you are prepared for today's proceedings?" Silas didn't answer, just stared at him with a look that would have made most men nervous. Ashford wasn't most men. He took his seat on the opposite side of the courtroom, confident and calm. The judge entered at 10 sharp. Judge Morrison was an old territorial judge known for being fair but hard. He'd seen it all: claim jumpers, cattle thieves, land disputes, murder trials. Nothing surprised him anymore. "We're here today for 2 matters," he announced. "The first, allegations against Miss Faith Garrett regarding the robbery of Willow Creek Bank. The second, a land dispute between Mr. Silas McCrae and the Northern Pacific Railroad." He looked around the courtroom. "But before we begin, Sheriff Harlan has informed me of some new developments." "Sheriff?" Harlan stood. "Your Honor, I have in custody 4 men who've confessed to robbing the Willow Creek Bank. They've also confessed that the robbery was staged, that they were hired to commit the crime and deliberately leave evidence pointing toward Miss Garrett." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "They were hired," Harlan continued, "by Mr. Vernon Ashford." The murmur became an uproar. Ashford shot to his feet. "That's absurd. I demand to see evidence." "Sit down, Mr. Ashford," Judge Morrison said quietly. Something in his voice made Ashford sit. "Sheriff, bring in your witnesses." The 4 men were brought in, still in shackles. They looked significantly less cocky than they had in the mountains. One by one, they testified, told the whole story, how Ashford had approached them, how he'd paid them to stage the robbery, how they were supposed to leave evidence pointing to Faith, how the plan was to keep Silas distracted while Ashford took his land through legal proceedings. By the time they finished, Ashford's face had gone white. Judge Morrison turned to him. "Mr. Ashford, do you have anything to say?" Ashford stood slowly. His confidence had evaporated. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the back of the chair in front of him. "Your Honor, these men are clearly lying, trying to save themselves." "Save themselves from what?" Morrison interrupted. "They've confessed to bank robbery. That's a hanging offense. What exactly would lying about you gain them?" Ashford had no answer. Morrison looked at Faith. "Miss Garrett, please stand." Faith stood, her legs unsteady. "The charges against you are dismissed, with the court's apology for your wrongful imprisonment." Faith swayed. Eleanor caught her arm, steadied her. Morrison turned back to Ashford. "As for you, Mr. Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and subornation of perjury. Deputies, take him into custody." "You can't, my company. I have lawyers." But the deputies were already moving forward. As they led Ashford past Silas, he stopped, looked at the man who'd orchestrated everything, who'd tried to steal his land and frame the woman he loved. "Robert told you about the land, didn't he?" Silas said quietly, "before he died." Ashford's jaw clenched. "Your brother was weak, sentimental, could have made us both rich if he'd just convinced you to sell. So you decided to take it anyway. Business is business, McCrae." Silas stepped closer, close enough that only Ashford could hear what he said next. "You failed. She's free. The land is mine. And you're going to prison. That's business, too." They led Ashford away. The courtroom erupted in conversation. People talking over each other, trying to process everything they'd just heard. But Silas didn't hear any of it, because Faith was walking toward him. The deputies had released her. She was free. She crossed the courtroom slowly. People moved out of her way, watching. When she reached Silas, she stopped. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Faith did something she'd never done before. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to knock her down. Silas held her back, felt her trembling, felt her tears soaking into his shirt. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's over." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't quite true, because the land hearing hadn't happened yet. The railroad might still have a claim. Ashford might be in custody, but the company he represented wasn't. And standing at the back of the courtroom, I could see someone else, a woman I didn't recognize, well-dressed, late 50s, watching the proceedings with sharp, intelligent eyes. She caught my gaze and nodded. Then she stood and walked forward. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "If I may address the court?" Morrison looked at her. "And you are?" "Margaret Pritchard Hayes, from Boston. Samuel Pritchard was my brother." The courtroom went silent. "I believe I have some documents relevant to the land dispute case." She opened her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all from Samuel Pritchard to his sister, all describing his gratitude to Silas's father, all explaining, in clear, lucid detail, his decision to deed the land to the man who'd saved his life. "My brother was dying," Mrs. Hayes said, "but he was of sound mind, and he wanted to make sure the McCrae family knew that the land was theirs, free and clear, no conditions, no debts." She handed the folder to the judge. "I was overseas when the railroad contacted me, said they'd purchased my brother's claim before his death. I told them they were mistaken. My brother owned nothing when he died except his gratitude. Everything else he'd already given away." She looked at Silas. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. Your letters reached me in London. It took time to make arrangements, but I'm here now. And I'm here to say that this land belongs to you. It always has." Judge Morrison read through the letters, took his time, made sure everything was in order. Finally he looked up. "The railroad's claim is denied. The land belongs to Silas McCrae, as it has for the past 20 years. Case dismissed." And just like that, it was over. Really over. Silas looked at Faith. Faith looked at him. They'd survived. Against all odds, against conspiracy and betrayal and a town that had judged them both, they'd survived. But surviving wasn't the same as living. That part was just beginning. The courthouse emptied slowly. People lingered, talking in clusters, trying to make sense of everything they'd witnessed. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved. A few looked like they'd known all along that Faith was innocent, but hadn't had the courage to say so out loud. Martha Perkins stood near the door watching Silas and Faith. She twisted her handkerchief in her hands, working up to something. Finally she approached. "Miss Garrett," she said quietly. Faith turned. Her eyes were still red from crying, but she'd composed herself, straightened her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. Martha held out a basket covered with cloth. "Apple pie," she said. "Made it this morning." Her voice cracked on the last word. She couldn't quite meet Faith's eyes. "I was wrong about you, wrong for a long time. I judged you without knowing you. I whispered when I should have spoken up. She stopped, took a breath, tried again. There's no excuse for it. I can only say I'm sorry and hope that someday you might forgive me." Faith looked at the basket, at Martha's trembling hands, at the genuine remorse in her face. She took the pie. "Thank you, Martha." 2 words, simple, but they held grace enough for both of them. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once, then hurried away before she could break down completely. Eleanor appeared at Faith's elbow. "That took courage," she said quietly, "for both of you." Faith leaned against her friend. "I'm so tired, Eleanor." "I know. Come on, let's get you home." But the preacher stopped them on the courthouse steps. Behind him were a dozen townspeople, some Faith recognized from the store, others she'd never spoken to. "Miss Garrett," the preacher said, "we owe you an apology, all of us. We let fear make us cruel. We let suspicion make us blind. We forgot that this community is supposed to be a place of sanctuary, not judgment." He gestured to the people behind him. "We'd like to make it right, if you'll let us." Faith didn't know what to say. Looked to Silas for help. He stepped forward, put his hand on the small of her back, a gesture of support, of solidarity. "What Faith needs," he said, "is time and space, and for folks to treat her like she belongs here, because she does." The preacher nodded. "Of course. But when you're ready, when both of you are ready, we'd be honored to have you at Sunday service, and at the church social next month, and anywhere else in this town you want to be." He extended his hand to Faith. She took it. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." They rode back to the cabin in silence. Not the heavy silence of before, but something lighter, softer. The silence of 2 people who'd been through hell and were just now realizing they'd made it to the other side. The sun was setting as they approached the valley. Golden light spilled across the mountains, painting everything amber and rose. Faith's flowers were blooming by the porch, gold and purple, just like she'd planted them weeks ago. The garden had survived, had grown, even while everything else fell apart. Silas dismounted first, then helped Faith down. His hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Faith admitted. "Ask me tomorrow." They went inside. The cabin smelled like home, wood smoke and coffee and the faint trace of lavender from Faith's clothes. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, but somehow different, like the place itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Faith walked to the corner where her valise sat. She'd left it there the night before her arrest, trusting it would be safe, trusting this place was home. She picked it up now, carried it to the table, opened it slowly. Inside were the last remnants of her old life, the handkerchief Silas had given her that first night, a dried marigold from her garden, and buried at the bottom, a few letters she'd kept, not from James Hollister. Those were long gone, but letters from Catherine in Ohio, letters that reminded her of who she'd been before Montana, before Silas. She took them out one by one, read them in the lamplight while Silas made coffee. Catherine's words were full of worry. "Are you safe? Are you happy? Do you want to come home? Home." Faith looked around the cabin, at the clean windows and the mended curtains and the books on the shelf where she and Silas practiced reading together, at the garden visible through the open door, at the man standing at the stove, his back to her, giving her space to process everything. She took out paper and pen, started writing. "Dear Catherine, I'm safe, I'm happy, and I am home. I am your friend, Faith." She folded the letter carefully, set it aside to mail tomorrow. Then she did something she'd been thinking about since the moment the judge dismissed the charges. She opened the stove door and placed the old letters inside. Not James's, those were already ashes, but the ones from her factory days, the ones full of exhaustion and hopelessness, and counting down days until she could escape. She didn't need those anymore. The paper caught fire quickly, curled and blackened, and turned to smoke that rose up through the chimney and disappeared into the Montana sky. When the last piece had burned, Faith reached into the valise one more time, She pulled out a small scrap of paper, wrote one word on it with careful letters, home. She placed it in the bottom of the valise, closed the lid, set it back in its corner. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. He'd been watching from the stove, quiet, letting her have this moment. "Claiming it," Faith said simply. "This place, this life, you." She turned to face him. "I came here on a lie, but I stayed for the truth. And the truth is, Silas McCrae, I don't want to be anywhere else. I don't want to be with anyone else. This is where I belong." Silas set down his coffee cup, crossed the room in 3 strides. He took her hands in his, looked down at her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Been trying to find the words for weeks now, but they never come out right, so I'm just going to say it plain." He took a breath. "That first night, when I found you in the storm, I thought I was saving you, thought I was doing a kindness for a stranger. But the truth is, Faith, you saved me." His thumbs brushed across her knuckles. "I was dying out here, slowly. Didn't even realize it until you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to be alive. To care about something beyond just surviving. To hope." Faith felt tears gathering, but didn't let them fall. "My father made me promise to never let this land go to someone who didn't love it," Silas continued. "And I kept that promise, kept it by staying alone, by pushing everyone away, by convincing myself that loving the land meant I couldn't love anything or anyone else." He lifted one hand to her face, cupped her cheek. "But you love this land. I see it every time you work in the garden, every time you look out at the valley like you can't believe something so beautiful is real. And watching you love it made me realize something." "What?" Faith whispered. "That my father's promise wasn't about being alone. It was about finding someone who could see what he saw. Someone who could help protect it, not from me being with them, but by being with me." He leaned closer. "You make me better, Faith. You make this place better. And if you'll have me, if you'll stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to, I'd be honored to call you my wife." Faith's breath caught. She'd imagined this moment late at night when she couldn't sleep. Had wondered if Silas felt the same way she did, if what had grown between them was real or just circumstance. 2 lonely people clinging to each other because it was better than being alone. But looking at him now, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope and fear mixed together, she knew this was real. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be." He kissed her then. Gentle at first, then deeper. A kiss that tasted like coffee and promise and everything they'd survived to get to this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Should we tell people?" Faith asked. "Or just do it?" "However you want," Silas said. "But I'm thinking we invite the whole damn town. Make them watch us be happy, despite everything they put us through." Faith laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was bright and free, and so unlike the careful, measured way she usually spoke that it startled them both. "I like that idea," she said. They went outside to sit on the porch. The stars were coming out, filling the sky with more light than seemed possible. The valley stretched wide and dark before them, peaceful and eternal. Faith leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Anything. That first night, in the storm, why did you stop for me?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "Don't know," he said finally. "Just did." Faith smiled, reached for his hand. "My mother used to say that Providence sends people when we need them most," she whispered. "Not a moment sooner. Not a moment later. You believe that? I do now." They sat together as the night deepened. 2 people who'd been lost and broken and abandoned, who'd found each other in a storm and built something neither could have built alone. Something that looked a lot like home. I'm an old man now, riding this valley one last time. 15 years have passed since that courthouse hearing. 15 years since Faith Garrett and Silas McCrae stood together and refused to break, no matter what the world threw at them. I can see their ranch in the distance now. It's grown since then. New barn, expanded house, fences that stretch farther than they used to, and gardens. Oh, the gardens. Faith's flowers are everywhere, bright splashes of color against the Montana earth. Children are playing in the yard, 3 of them. The oldest, a girl about 10, has Faith's brown hair and Silas's quiet strength. The younger 2 are chasing chickens, while a woman I recognize as Faith calls after them to be gentle. She's older now, we all are, but she's smiling in a way she never could that first year, smiling like someone who's finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Silas comes around the corner of the barn, carrying lumber. He's grayer now, moves a little slower, but he's still strong, still solid. He sees me riding up and sets down the wood, comes to meet me. "Wilbur," he says, gripping my hand, "last delivery?" "Last one," I confirm. I pull a letter from my satchel. It's from Catherine in Ohio. She still writes, even after all these years. Faith writes back. They've become pen pals in truth now, not just old factory friends, but real friends who understand each other's journeys. Faith comes to take the letter. She reads the address and smiles. "Come inside," she says. "Have coffee before you go." "Can't," I say. "Gotta finish the route. Tommy's waiting in town to take over." But I dismount anyway. Stand there looking at them both. These 2 people I've watched build a life from ruins. "Thank you," Faith says quietly, "for everything, for warning us, for believing in us, for carrying all those letters." "Even the bad ones?" I ask. "Especially the bad ones," she says, "because they led me here." She takes Silas's hand. Their fingers intertwine naturally, automatically, the way they do when you've been together long enough that touch becomes a language you don't have to think about. I tip my hat to them both. "You take care of each other," I say. "Always have," Silas replies. "Always will." I ride away slowly, look back once and see them standing together watching me go. Their children have joined them now, all 5 of them framed against the mountains like a painting of everything frontier life is supposed to be, but so rarely is. Family, home, belonging. I've carried letters for 40 years. Some brought joy, some brought heartbreak, some brought lies that almost destroyed good people. But you know what I've learned? It's not the letters that matter most. It's what people do with them. Whether they let the lies break them or use them as kindling to start something new. Whether they let fear keep them alone or find the courage to reach for connection, even when it's risky, even when it hurts. Faith Garrett walked 40 miles on a promise that didn't exist. But she found truth at the end of that road, found a man who saw her worth when everyone else saw scandal, found a home in a place she'd never planned to be. And Silas McCrae, who'd convinced himself that keeping his father's promise meant staying alone, learned that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to build something living, something that grows. They survived because they chose each other, every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That's the story I'm leaving behind as I ride off this mail route for the last time. Not a story about a storm or a rescue or false accusations, but a story about 2 people who refused to let the world make them small, who stood together when it would have been easier to fall apart, who planted flowers in stubborn soil and watched them bloom. I'm done carrying letters now, but their story? That one's worth carrying forever. The valley spreads wide before me. The sun is setting behind the mountains, painting everything gold. My shadow stretches long across the road. I tip my hat to the empty trail ahead. "Now you carry it," I whisper to whoever's listening. Then I ride into the sunset, my work complete, their story safely delivered.